The sky over the Pacific did not merely darken that morning. It collapsed, as if the weight of the war itself had finally broken through the clouds. The warning siren began to howl, but it was already too late. By the time its sound reached the men scattered across the airfield, Japanese aircraft were tearing overhead, their engines screaming with predatory fury. Bombs fell in measured intervals, shaking the ground like a living thing. Concrete split apart. Steel shrieked. Hangars vanished in pillars of flame where they had stood moments earlier. Captain Daniel Mercer was halfway into his flight jacket when the first explosion slammed the air from his chest and sent him stumbling. He caught himself against a fueled drum, heart hammering, ears ringing. 300 enemy planes. That number would come later. In that moment, there was only fire, noise, and instinct. P-40s. Get them airborne, someone shouted. Whether an officer or a terrified mechanic, Mercer never knew. It didn't matter. He was already moving. He ran through smoke and falling debris toward his aircraft. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk waited at the edge of the runway, olive drab paint smeared with oil and morning dew. It wasn't the fastest fighter in the sky. It wasn't graceful, but it was solid, brutally honest, and it had brought him home before. Bullets tore into the ground behind him as Mercer vaulted into the cockpit. Tracer rounds snapped past the canopy. He slammed the throttle forward. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. All around him, the airfield was dying. Aircraft burned before they could move. Others tried to taxi and were obliterated in fountains of fire. Men ran, fell, and did not rise again. Mercer did not wait for clearance. The P-40 surged forward, tires bouncing over shattered concrete. A bomb detonated to his left, flipping a fuel truck end over end. The shockwave lifted the Warhawk's tail and slammed it back down. Come on, Mercer whispered through clenched teeth. At the very end of the runway, enemy fighters diving straight toward him, he pulled back on the stick. The P-40 leapt into the sky. Above him stretched a sight so vast it felt unreal. Japanese Zeros and bombers filled the horizon, layered at multiple altitudes, flowing forward in dense, coordinated waves. It wasn't an air raid. It was a moving wall. Mercer swallowed hard. This wasn't a mission. It was an execution, and he was the only American climbing to meet it. The first Zero streaked past, so close Mercer caught a glimpse of the pilot's goggles. Training took over. He rolled hard left, felt the crushing weight of G-forces, and squeezed the trigger. The P-40's .50 caliber machine guns thundered, the recoil rattling the aircraft. The Zero vanished in a violent bloom of fire and twisted metal. There was no time to think. Another fighter dove in, then another, then another. The P-40 was never meant to dogfight Zeros. The Japanese planes were lighter, more agile, built for turning battles. Mercer refused to give them one. He used speed, gravity, and timing, diving like a thrown blade through the formation. A bomber's wing exploded apart. A fighter spiraled downward, trailing smoke. Then the smell of burning oil filled his cockpit. Warning lights flickered. Gauges wavered. Fuel pressure dropped. A hydraulic line bled out. Still flying. Below him, the base burned. Ammunition detonated in brutal chain reactions. Hangars collapsed inward. Men he had shared coffee with that morning were now names that would be typed on condolence letters. Above him, still hundreds of enemy aircraft. Where the hell is everyone? Mercer muttered into the radio. Only static replied. That was when he understood. This was not an attack meant to win territory. It was meant to erase the base entirely, to leave nothing standing, nothing usable. So Mercer stayed. Again and again he climbed, dove, and struck, never lingering, never turning when speed meant survival. He went after the bombers first, ripping into them before they could release their payloads. Fighters swarmed him like hornets, tearing at his aircraft. He was hit, then hit again. The P-40 shuddered but refused to die. For a brief moment, the sky fell silent. Mercer found himself alone against endless blue, hands trembling, sweat soaking his collar. He sucked in shallow breaths, fighting exhaustion. Then he saw them. Another wave. And he turned straight toward it. By the third engagement, Mercer had lost all sense of time. His ammunition ran low. The left aileron responded sluggishly. Blood from a gash on his forehead slid into his eye. The radio crackled faintly. One American fighter, still airborne. That was him. The Japanese pilots noticed. They began to hunt him deliberately, breaking formation, baiting him, trying to force him into turning fights he could not win. Mercer refused every trap. He struck only when geometry favored him, short, brutal firing passes measured in seconds. A Zero lined up behind him. Mercer dove straight down. The ocean surged upward. The altimeter spun wildly. The Zero followed too long. At the last possible instant, Mercer pulled up. The P-40 screamed in protest. The Zero did not. It shattered against the sea in a white explosion. Mercer gasped for air, chest burning. He was exhausted, terrified, completely alone. But every bomber he destroyed meant fewer men dying below. Every fighter he dragged away bought precious seconds. Time still mattered. By mid-morning, the Japanese withdrew, not because they had failed, but because there was nothing left to destroy. Mercer followed as far as his fuel allowed, his guns clicking empty, oil streaking across the canopy. When he turned back, the silence was unbearable. The base was gone. He landed on what remained of the runway, tires skidding over ash and debris. The engine died the instant he cut power. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking so violently he could barely unbuckle his harness. He climbed out and stared at his aircraft. It was a miracle it had flown at all. Someone whispered, he went up alone. Another voice said, he kept coming back. The story spread quickly. One P-40, 300 Japanese planes, and a base that still existed, barely, because one man refused to leave. The paperwork began immediately. Eyewitness statements, damage assessments, gun camera footage showing enemy aircraft erupting into flame. Ground crews testified how bombers had been driven off before releasing their bombs. The commanding officer did not hesitate. Recommend Captain Daniel Mercer for the Medal of Honor. Mercer barely noticed. He was too busy pulling bodies from wreckage, too busy standing at graves without coffins, too busy reliving the sky in his sleep. The recommendation moved up the chain. Then it slowed. Questions appeared. Had he taken off without orders? Had he exceeded engagement limits? Could the scale of the enemy force truly be verified? Mercer heard none of it directly. He only felt the silence. The citation stalled. Then it was downgraded. Distinguished Service Cross. An honor, but not the honor. Mercer accepted it without protest. He stood straight. He saluted. He said nothing. Others were not silent. Pilots who had seen the sky. Mechanics who counted the bullet holes. Officers who knew what that single aircraft had prevented. They wrote letters. Filed appeals. The war moved on. History, already crowded with louder victories and bigger names, quietly turned away. Mercer survived the war. That alone made him fortunate. He came home older than his years, quieter than before. His injuries ended his combat flying. The sky, once his refuge, had taken enough. At reunions, someone would eventually bring it up. They say it was 300 planes. Mercer would shrug. Felt like more. He never chased the medal. When younger pilots asked why, he paused before answering. Because sometimes, he said, the truth doesn't fit neatly into a citation. Years passed. Records vanished. Witnesses died. The war faded into textbooks and grainy footage. But among those who truly knew, Mercer's story endured. Decades later, historians reopened the files. Enemy records matched gun camera film. The numbers held. A renewed recommendation was submitted. Again it climbed. Again it stalled. Policy. Precedent. Technicalities. Mercer did not live to see the final decision. At his burial, a lone P-40 flew overhead in missing man formation. Those who watched understood. Medal or not, hero or not, history had been wrong to look away. The sky remembers everything. It remembers engines screaming and metal tearing apart. It remembers one aircraft rising alone into impossible odds. It remembers courage without witnesses. Today, a restored P-40 sits in a museum. Visitors read the plaque and move on. But sometimes a child stops and stares. And somewhere in that silence, the truth still flies. One P-40, 300 planes, and a hero who did the job anyway.